Shalom everyone, this is Tom Thorne from Avdei El Elyon, Servants of the Most High God Ministries. Today is March 16th, 2023, and I hope everyone is doing well. Our class today will be part 3 of the 1 Samuel 28 through 31 literary unit that we have been covering. In our first message on this series, we saw how the Philistines were preparing to make war with Israel. For 16 months, David had been living near Achish, the king of Gath, one of the 5 lead Philistine cities. And Achish expected David to go to war with him, on his side, against Israel. In 1 Samuel 28, verse 4, we saw that the Philistines and Israel were assembled for war. The Philistines at Shunem, and Saul and Israel at Gilboa. In our second message, we reviewed events during Saul's last days before he was slain by the Philistines. Saul made 2 terrible mistakes before his death. He allowed himself to enter into a state of fear rather than trust in God. At the same time, when his requests were not being answered, he consulted with the medium at Endor, which was clearly against the teachings that he knew very well. Our class today will cover 1 Samuel chapters 29 and 30, and we're going to take a detour into the life of David at the same time frame that Saul was seeking the medium at Endor. We will see that David acted with godly wisdom and fear, and he was delivered from an extremely vulnerable position and blessed as well. My purpose today is to remind us that when in times of trial especially, we need to continue to obey the Lord. We need to continue to obey Yahweh and wait on Him for His inspiration, response, and deliverance. So let's begin today's lesson in 1 Samuel chapter 29, verse 1. Now the Philistines had gathered all their forces at Aphek, and the Israelites were encamped by the spring that is in Jezreel. As the lords of the Philistines were passing on by hundreds and by thousands, and David and his men were passing on in the rear with Achish. Saul chose a strategic site, one that provided the Israelite forces with a ready supply of water as well as food, because they anticipated northerly Philistine troop movements designed to take control of the valley of Jezreel. Jezreel was a vital segment of the trade route connecting Egypt with Mesopotamia. The spring of Jezreel was approximately 40 miles northeast of Aphek. The following map, the map here shows a visual as to where the activities of David were taking place. We can see in the solid line here, right down towards the middle of the map, David returning to Ziklag from Aphek. David returning. And the second line, the dotted line down here toward the bottom, shows where David attacking the Amalekites. And the third line shows towns that David gave spoils to after the attack, and we'll get to that later on in the story. As the Philistines were passing by in units of hundreds and thousands, David and his men were following after them along with Achish, who was apparently not taking the lead. So the Philistines were passing by hundreds and thousands, and David and Achish were following them, bringing up the rear. Verses 3 through 5. The commanders of the Philistines said, "What are these Hebrews doing here?" And Achish said to the commanders of the Philistines, "Is this not David, the servant of Saul, king of Israel, who has been with me now for days and years? And since he has deserted to me, I have found no fault with him to this day." But the commanders of the Philistines were angry with him. And the commanders of the Philistines said to him, "Send the man back, that he may return to the place to which you have assigned him. He shall not go down with us to battle, lest in the battle he become an adversary to us. For how could this fellow reconcile himself to his Lord? Would it not be with the heads of the men here?" Is not this David, of whom they sing to one another in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. As you can imagine, the Philistine commanders naturally had some trepidation regarding David and his mighty men. They saw what David was capable of, and were not convinced of his loyalty. After all, David, as an inexperienced fighter, took down Goliath. Achish made a conclusive argument for keeping David on his side. He found nothing wrong with David since the day he had deserted to him. Achish knew of the power of David and his men. He also must have felt that God was on David's side. In his way of thinking, this might have led to the final overthrow of Israel. But still, the Philistine commanders, the chiefs, strongly objected to Achish's desire to use David for fear he might turn on them. The leaders may have had more influence than normal, considering the pentopolis nature of Philistia. There were 5 separate kings over the 5 major cities of Philistia: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, and Ekron, although they united in time of war. The chiefs told Achish to send David back to the place where he was assigned. Verses 6 through 11. Then Achish called David and said to him, "As the Lord lives, you have been honest, and to me it seems right that you should march out and in with me in the campaign. For I have found nothing wrong in you from the day of your coming to me to this day. Nevertheless, the Philistine lords do not approve of you. So go back now and go peaceably, that you may not displease the lords of the Philistines." And David said to Achish, "But what have I done? What have you found in your servant from the day I entered your service until now, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king?" And Achish answered David and said, "I know that you are as blameless in my sight as an angel from God. Nevertheless, the commanders of the Philistines have said, 'He shall not go up with us to battle.' Now then, rise early in the morning with the servants of your Lord who came with you, and start early in the morning, and depart as soon as you have light." So David set out with his men early in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines. But the Philistines went up to Jezreel. After the conclusion of the Philistine commander's passionate and dramatic argument, Achish begins his address to David. He admits that David had been good to him, and even goes so far as to compliment him profusely. But he tells David of the Philistine leaders' complaints, and that he must agree with them, and for David to go back peaceably and not disturb the troops who were about to go to war. In other words, just don't rock the boat, David. Just go. Now David found himself in an awkward situation to say the least. Where does his loyalty stand? It stands with God and Israel, yet he is now in a spot where it is very hard to deny Achish. After all, he was provided safety from Saul for the past 16 months. David, in objection, asks Achish what he has ever done wrong to him. One must wonder now if he was serious in this objection, or just saying this to try to make Achish feel he was loyal to him. As the plot thickens, one must also wonder if David was really starting to get concerned about fighting against his own country. Maybe David felt like this was the spot God had put him in, and he had to completely rely on God to work it out for the best, which he did, by relieving David of his responsibility to fight alongside Achish. Achish, in response to David, tells David that he is so blameless, he is like a messenger from God. Achish may have truly thought that David came as a messenger from God, and this was his clue that it was time to war with Israel. He might have thought that God, Yahweh, was now on his side, since David is now on his side. Achish's concluding remarks to David are for him and his men to rise early in the morning and return. Achish at this point was demanding this of David, evidenced by use of the verb valeku, which is an imperative conjugation, a direct command, in this case using valeku for the word leave in verse 10. He was commanding him to leave. Now let's pause and rethink this situation. David had been staying with the Philistines under rulership of Achish for 16 months. Achish decided for the Philistines to go to war with Israel, and he at first expected David to be on his side. Achish, his commanding officers, refused to let David come along with them, and David was sent back to Ziklag. In fact, he was commanded to go back. Now let's look at how David must have felt. Initially, I would think that David was confused, bewildered, and dumbfounded at the situation. He had been with Achish for 16 months and things seemed to have gone well. He had even done some things to benefit Israel on the side. Suddenly, Achish decides he's going to go to war with Israel, and David and his men are going to fight with him. This may have very well taken David by surprise. Maybe it shouldn't have, but I think it possibly did. I would expect that David was puzzled. Achish had been loyal to him in providing him a place of refuge from Saul. Yet David's true loyalty was to God and Israel. David, instead of making a rash decision on his own, waited on the Lord. David penned the words in Psalm 27:14, "Wait for the Lord. Be strong, and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord." I would think that this incident could very well have been part of the inspiration for this scripture. David did wait on the Lord. He waited on the Lord, and he received an answer. He received deliverance and a blessing. Did he realize how much of a blessing being relieved of fighting with Achish was? Did he realize this right away? I would think he probably did. It's hard to imagine how relieved David must have felt. So the next step for David was to return to the land of the Philistines, Ziklag, where a big surprise awaited him. Do we ever feel like the expression, "when it rains, it pours," is true? It's so true. Well, let's see what happened to David next. 1 Samuel 30, verses 1 through 3. Now when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day, the Amalekites had made a raid against the Negev and against Ziklag. They had overcome Ziklag and burned it with fire, and taken captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great. They killed no one, but carried them off and went their way. Verse 3, and when David and his men came to the city, they found it burned with fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. David has gone from one catastrophe to another. First, he was in a tremendous situation of stress where he was being expected to fight against his home nation and his God. To his benefit, he waited on the Lord. He waited on Yahweh for an answer and was given unexpected relief. Now, as he returns to the land he was staying in, Ziklag, he finds it burnt up, and the women, including his two wives, Achinoam and Abigail, that's Ahinoam and Abigail, Abigail as we pronounce them, and all the children taken hostage. To make matters seem even worse, it was the Amalekites, the people that Saul had earlier been ordered to eliminate completely, who did it. To an ordinary person, this would have caused rage to burn against both the Amalekites and Saul. David now finds himself in another situation of great pressure. Moving on to verses 4 through 6. Then David and the people who were with him raised their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep. David's two wives also had been taken captive, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David was greatly distressed, For the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. David was greatly distressed. The people spoke of stoning him. All the people were bitter in soul for their sons, daughters, and wives. But David strengthened himself in the Lord. He didn't give up. He didn't throw in the towel or lose faith. We need to realize what a situation David was in. He had just been through a great trial. His heart and spirit could have hardly have seemed to have time to rebound. And now this, another huge trial. His loyal men are now speaking of stoning him. The women and children of his group are gone. His city is burned to the ground. Oh God, what is going on? But David strengthened himself. He didn't let the situation master him. Verses 7 through 8. And David said to Abiathar, the priest, the son of Ahimelech, bring me the ephod. So Abiathar brought the ephod to David. And David inquired of Yahweh, shall I pursue after this band? Shall I overtake them? He answered them, pursue, for you shall surely overtake and shall surely rescue. One reason for the strength that David was able to utilize was the fact that he communicated with the living God. David could not reach out to the Philistine army for help in pursuing the Amalekites, nor could he reach out to the armies of Israel. Yet he could, and he did, reach up to the Lord of hosts, Yahweh Zebaot, to request help. As was the proper custom, he reached out to Abiathar the priest for aid and inquired of the Lord by means of the ephod. The ephod being the vestment made of fine linen that consisted of 2 pieces, which hung from the neck and covered both the back and the front. The 2 pieces were joined together over the shoulders by clasps or buckles of gold or precious stones, and fastened around the waist as well. The breastplate with the Urim and the Thummim was attached to the ephod. In answer to David's question about the advisability and probable success of a mission to pursue the Amalekites, the Lord indicated that David and his men would certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue. A sharp distinction between David and Saul is brought out here in verses 6 through 8. During a time of great distress for both of them, they both sought guidance for battle. Chronologically, they were probably seeking guidance on the same day. However, one defiled the Torah, the other utilized its gracious provision. Saul sought help from a medium and received the promise of death. David sought help through an Aaronic priest using the ephod and received the promise, which was later fulfilled, of life and blessing. If I put myself in David's shoes here, I can imagine the temptation to do completely different. David was just getting through a huge trial. His emotions, they were probably still on edge. But now, he and his powerful band of warriors come and find their land destroyed and the people taken captive. How easy it would have been to charge forward in a fit of rage and not seek God. But David once again did the right thing. He waited on the Lord. He followed the proper steps, used the assistance of Abiathar the priest, and counseled with God before he went any further. Verses 9 through 14. So David set out, and the 600 men who were with him, and they came to the brook Besor, where those who were left behind stayed. But David pursued, he and 400 men. 200 stayed behind, who were too exhausted to cross the brook Besor. They found an Egyptian in the open country and brought him to David, and they gave him bread and he ate. They gave him water to drink, and they gave him a piece of a cake of figs and 2 clusters of raisins. And when he had eaten, his spirit revived, for he had not eaten bread nor drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. And David said to him, "To whom do you belong? Where are you from?" He said, "I am an Egyptian, a man of Egypt, servant to an Amalekite. And my master left me behind because I fell sick 3 days ago. We had made a raid against the Negev of the Cherethites, and against the land which belongs to Judah, and against the Negev of Caleb. And we burned Ziklag with fire." As David and 400 of his 600 warriors pursued the band of Amalekites, they traveled about 16 miles south and came until they came to the brook Besor, the largest and deepest wadi in the heartlands of southern Judah. A wadi being a channel or water course that is dry except during periods of rainfall. They found an Egyptian who was a servant to an Amalekite, who, because of illness, had been abandoned in an open field. Because of such treatment, this person may have had some animosity toward the Amalekites and may have been willing to provide valuable information to David. They gave him water and fed him a nice meal. Once again, we find a special attribute of David's character here. Instead of taking this Egyptian and threatening him with beatings if he didn't tell David what he wanted to hear, David treated the Egyptian with kindness and graciousness. Even in the midst of personal tragedy, David was sensitive to Torah instructions regarding the treatment of aliens. In Leviticus 19:34, where the Israelites are told they should treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. This incident with the unnamed Egyptian sojourner, you could say, measures the circumference of David's heart, David's soul. David was racked with emotional pain, but he was not so wrapped up in his own problems that he could not help another person in need. The greatness of David's character is here seen in the greatness of his provision for an alien in need. From the Egyptian, David learned that the Amalekites' raids were on 3 different regions. First, the Negev of the Cherethites, which was a coastal area inhabited by allies of the Philistines. Second was territory belonging to Judah. Now this is part of the holdings of David's ancestral tribe east of Ziklag. And third, it was of the land of the Negev of Caleb, which is a special allotment of Judah's territory. David asked a favor of this Egyptian. He asked for information, to give a truthful response. Now there was a risk involved for the Egyptian. Therefore, he asked for some assurances of protection. He required David to take an oath before God to assure that he would not be killed or returned to the Amalekites. David also was taking a large risk in following the stranger's advice. He was placing a great deal of trust in this man who he only knew for a very brief period of time. How could he have been sure that this person wasn't planted by the Amalekites to lead David astray? It was a risk. But David must have felt the lead of the Holy Spirit to do so. This also was waiting on the Lord, following his guidance instead of rushing into action without prayer and guidance. As it turns out, this was a very wise move on David's part. Next, let's move on to verses 15 through 20. And David said to him, "Will you take me down to this band?" And he said, "Swear to me by God that you will not kill me or deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will take you to this band." And when he had taken him down, behold, they were spread abroad over all the land, eating and drinking, because of all the great spoil they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. And David struck them down from twilight until evening of the next day, and not a man of them escaped, except 400 young men who mounted camels and fled. Verse 18, David recovered all that the Amalekites had taken, and David rescued his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, whether small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything that had been taken. David brought back all. David also captured all the flocks and herds, and the people drove the livestock before him and said, "This is David's spoil." David and his men won a great victory. Two objectives were accomplished. First, David defeated the Amalekites. Second, the persons and possessions that were taken were recovered. In fact, so complete was the nullification of the Amalekites by David's army, they were not mentioned again as an opponent of Israel until the time of Hezekiah, which was about 700 BC. In taking large risks, David's efforts paid off very well. Especially significant was that the Israelite prisoners of war were set free, including David's wives and everyone else. Because of the magnitude of their victory, David's troops took control of large quantities of goods and livestock left behind by the Amalekites. Much of this booty had previously been owned by the Kerethites, the Calebites, and other Judahites. However, David and his men came into possession of it by right of conquest. After all, they were the ones who put their lives on the line to attack the Amalekites, and it was already lost to previous owners. Verses 21 through 25. Then David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow David, and who had been left at the brook Besor. And they went out to meet David, and to meet the people who were with him. And when David came near the people, he greeted them. Then all the wicked and worthless fellows among the men who had gone with David said, "Because they did not go with us, we will not give them any of the spoil that we have recovered, except that each man may lead his wife and children and depart." But David said, "Wait a minute. You shall not do so, my brothers, with what the Lord has given us. He has preserved us and given into our hands the band that came against us. Who would listen to you in this matter? For as his share is who goes down into the battle, so shall his share be who stays by the baggage. They shall share alike." And he made this a statute and a rule for Israel from that day forward to this day, till the time of that writing. Now we come across another interesting decision David made. We read back in verse 10 that only 400 men went with David to pursue the Amalekites. That means that 200, because of exhaustion, remained by the brook Besor. After the successful military raid by David and the 400, they returned to the brook. David greeted the 200, showing concern for their welfare. As a good general, a good manager, or a good leader, he was concerned that his temporarily disabled soldiers were recovering. We don't see him rebuking them or scolding them for failure to participate in the raid. Yet a contentious situation was developing. Some of the 400 who did participate in the raid were resentful toward those who did not. In their opinion, those who did not participate should not share in the wealth gained, the spoils of the victory. David rejected this idea and created a statute, an ordinance, regarding the distribution of plunder that was to be followed by Israelite armies for centuries thereafter. The policy was that the share of the man who stayed with the supplies is to be the same as that of him who went down to battle. Now there are three foundational premises to this policy. First, all plunder gained in battle is a gracious gift from Yahweh. Second, booty is one of the lesser gifts provided by the Lord to those who fought in the war. Personal protection and the defeat of the enemy was more important. And third, successful military operations require the performance of many different tasks. Some may need to be done away from the battlefield, while some in the heat of the battle. Each job is vital to success, and therefore all team members should share in the fruits of success. Now there are spiritual correlations to each of these three premises as well. The first is that all blessings from obedience to God are a gift from Yahweh. The second These blessings, these gifts are smaller items. The saving of our lives, salvation, and defeat of Satan are much more important. And third, each of us, as believers in Jesus, as believers in Yeshua, can help each other. We will all, therefore, celebrate the victory. Let's move on now to verses 26 through 31. When David came to Ziklag, he sent parts of the spoil to his friends, the elders of Judah, saying, "Here is a present for you from the spoil of the enemies of the Lord." 27. It was for those in Bethel, in Ramoth, in the Negev, in Jatir, in Aror, in Siphmoth, in Eshtemoa, in Rakal, in the cities of the Jerahmeelites, in the cities of the Kenites, in Hormah, in Borashan, in Athak, in Hebron, for all the places where David and his men had roamed. When David returned to Ziklag, he wisely chose to invest some of his newly acquired resources in building relationships with the elders, who controlled settlements located throughout southern Judah. He may have did this to create a network of treaties that would allow him to move his sizable band of soldiers and their families back into Judahite territory. Another reason for this may have been related to David presenting his gift to them as a present or a barakah, a blessing. This present was from the plunder of the Lord's enemies, and may suggest that he also was using this gift as an announcement of his divine appointment. David was the Lord's anointed, but rather than proclaim his statute with mere words, he would announce it with deeds. As would be expected of the Lord's anointed, David had fought the Lord's enemies, and he was now bringing himself to the Lord's people. David's use of the phrase, enemies of the Lord, in verse 26, is in reference to the Amalekites. And this provides a key to the interpretation here. It casts David's military exploits as a crusade that is essentially theological in nature, not a conquest that is fundamentally profane and secular. His actions against the Amalekites were not only vengeance for burned houses and displaced families, they were also acts of spiritual obedience, the fulfillment of ancient Torah mandates and the fulfillment of timeless prophecies to destroy the Amalekites, such as Exodus 17:4, Deuteronomy 25:17 through 19, and 1 Samuel 15:2 through 3. In summary, David acted in three commendably righteous ways in this story. First, he acted with humility on three occasions. He acted with humility with gracious treatment of the Egyptian slave who they found in an open field. He acted with humility with the treatment of the 200 who could not travel further than the brook Besor in pursuit of the Amalekites. And he acted with humility after the victory when he sent tribute to many regions. The fact that David sent gifts to these three different sites associated with the Levites suggests that the future king was both giving a tithe and more of the battlefield acquisitions. And David acted righteously. The second point whereby David acted righteously was that he acted with faith. David took risks for the Lord. When they came across the Egyptian in the open field, they had no idea who he was. David asked the Egyptian if he would take him to the raiding band of the Amalekites. It's possible that this Egyptian had been set in place as a decoy to lead David's men to a path of destruction. David took the risk that his prayer to God was being answered and that this man was telling the truth. Now this took faith. And thirdly, David waited for the Lord on two occasions. First, when Achish expected David to fight along with him against Israel, David was in a bind. He waited on Yahweh to provide a means of escape from the situation. And second, after the Amalekites destroyed Ziklag, David followed the proper procedures by going to the priest and requesting guidance from the Lord. He didn't go off in a fit of rage and take matters into his own hands. He waited for the Lord's answer and guidance. Waiting on the Lord. Several years ago, a husband and wife that I know were seeking the Lord. They had been involved in different churches over their past lives, but they'd never come into contact with one or been involved with one that they felt would really help them with their growth process with Jesus, with Yeshua. They had become discouraged. They were earnestly requesting, through much prayer, that they be shown a church or a fellowship whereby they would learn more about the Lord and grow, gain an understanding. The situation went on and on. They prayed and prayed but received no answer. Then suddenly, after about a year of diligently seeking the Lord, the wife saw an advertisement in a small-time local newspaper about a series of Bible studies in their vicinity. Immediately, it seemed, the wife knew this was the answer to their prayer. Yet the wife became nervous as the date for the first Bible study drew near. She'd been burned too many times at different groups. But she strengthened herself in the Lord, and both her and her husband attended. Indeed, they found a congregation that was just what they needed. And their growth in friendliness, love, and compassion these two people have experienced over the years is wonderful. They have even become involved in leadership activities, which they may never have before. In faith, they waited on the Lord, who provided an answer. Now we may ask, why didn't God provide the answer for them right away, or after a short period of time of seeking Him? Why did they have to wait so long? After all, this was a righteous thing that they were asking, wasn't it? We can speculate on the answer to that, and there may be several reasons for it, but it doesn't matter. God knows what's best, and He knows the best time for it. God knows all things. He cares for us. He loves us. He only wants the best for us. David provided a great example for us of waiting for the Lord. These two individuals I mentioned above did so also, and they were blessed for doing so. Let's remember the teaching of David from Psalm 27, verse 14. 27, verse 14. Kaveh el Yahweh. Wait for the Lord. Be strong and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. Kaveh el Yahweh. Shalom, everyone. Shavua Tov. Have a good week. And in closing, let's all say the Aaronic blessing together. Number 6, 24 through 26. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make His face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up His countenance upon you and give you peace. And we'll say it together in Hebrew also. Yivareka Yahweh, Bahishmereka, Ya'er Yahweh, Panav Eleka, Bihuneka, Yasa Yahweh, Panav Eleka, Vayasem Leka Shalom. Amen and Amen. Shalom, everyone.